Thank you, Dr. Topichkanov, for your presentation. You have also again gathered a few questions. We are looking at 25 questions now. I'm trying to bundle them together because a lot of them are overlapping. Just I hope Dr. Malaiz Daud will speak now. Malaiz Daud has been the chief of staff of President Ashraf Ghani, and has been working with various organizations, with the Barcelona Foundation there was, and now with EFSAS as well, and is doing currently some research projects on Afghanistan. Malaiz, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be in the company of this distinguished panel. Obviously, unfortunately, it's not only that I've replaced a woman, it's also that a mediocre scholar like myself has replaced a genuinely distinguished scholar like Muscar Dastagir. Anyhow, so I was drafted in last minute. Can I share my screen? And I tried to put together my thoughts in a few slides. Let me just anyhow, my work actually has been based on the contribution of a lot of women, particularly my wife, and especially my research in Pakistan is thanks to her, because her interest was in researching the nonviolent movements of Pashtuns in Pakistan, which I took over because of childbearing. She had to take over at home, and she wanted me to continue that. And this presentation is the culmination of my kitchen table discussions with my wife, who also happens to be a political scientist. So thanks to her, I've just tried to put together my ideas through a very particular prism here. Here I'm borrowing something, the title is partially borrowed by a title that was used in, I think, 1978 by Robert J. Antonio, The Contradiction of Domination Production in Pakistan and the Trajectories of Terrorism in the Region. What I mean by this is, and Antonio had actually, in his paper, it was 1979, sorry, he has appropriated the Weberian concept of production and domination. And basically, in very basic terms, domination basically means the controls of persons and resources in the Weberian sense, and production means the production and distribution of goods and services. And how this relates to Pakistan is important. I'd like to be quick because I know we've taken a little longer than we had scheduled. Countries like Pakistan are called by political scientists like myself anocracies. So they combine elements of dictatorships and democratic rule. So Pakistan has been democratic and at the same time autocratic for a lot of its history. Here, the domination part is that you see this cycles of democratic and autocratic rules. So you have what they call in Pakistan civilian rules and army rules. The army basically rules the country both directly and indirectly, like in the case of Parvez Musharraf or General Ziaul Haq, you had army taking control of the country, but when it comes to its current government of Prime Minister Khan, in Pakistan, they call it a hybrid democracy, and obviously it is also called the puppet of the army. The army has its own ways of dominating and control in Pakistan. But at times, these so-called puppets, they are old allies of the army, but can become its foes too, its main challenger. And I think the case of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is a very significant one here, who's become a constant thorn in the side of the Pakistan army in the past few years. When it comes to the production side of it, basically when the governments fail to deliver services or the promises that they have made, then you normally see a waning in their control and emergence of another force that takes over power. But the perception can also be created that a government has failed. And the Pakistani army has been really good at creating these perceptions, and the perception that it's invincible, and the perception, though that is challenged nowadays, the perception that Pakistani army is better at delivering both services and goods than civilian governments. And that's exactly what they did with the last government of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. What are the main elements of production? Economy is extremely important for the people of Pakistan, and inflation that we see nowadays in Pakistan is a huge factor for the weakening of the Khan rule. Security has been made this mammoth issue by the Pakistan military, particularly the animosity that they perpetrate against India, and international prestige. Pakistan is the fort of Islam, and so on and so forth, and how Pakistan is a significant player not only in the region, but also internationally, particularly vis-a-vis India. That is an important thing for people in Pakistan. Okay, and now the important point is that we had the Senate elections in the past couple of weeks in Pakistan, and one of the things that happened was that a former prime minister of the Pakistan People's Party was the joint candidate of the opposition parties, and he was running against the current Treasury Minister of Pakistan, who was as explained by Sheikh Rashid Ahmad, the Interior Minister of Pakistan, he was the candidate of the state, which means he was backed by the army. And the former Prime Minister won that election. And that set in motion a number of events. And one of them was the election for the chairmanship of the Senate, which became extremely contentious, though the candidate of the army won the election. But there's a lot of tension right now in Pakistan. So what are the characteristics of when we see an onset of a democratic cycle? Normally, you see that the army is facing, and its narrative is facing a lot of challenges. Is it happening right now? Yes, it's pervasive in media by movements such as the Pashtun Tahafuz Movement, and political parties who are part of the Pakistan Democratic Movement, including the Prime Minister Sharif's party, they've been challenging army in its claims. The second characteristic is when you see major political parties posing direct challenge to military rule. And that is also happening. The main opposition parties have come together. They're not only going to courts, doing politics inside the parliament, they're also coming out on the streets, staging huge protests. So that's a huge challenge. The third characteristic that we see is you see emergence of both violent and non-violent insurgencies. I'm using insurgencies here basically on how it is used in the scholarship on social movements and collective action. Insurgency doesn't have such a negative connotation there. It basically means those who challenge the rule. So you have movements like PDM, who are non-violently challenging the rule. And then you have TTP, and we have seen a spike in their attacks recently. Even the Chief of Staff of Pakistan Army visited, I think it was last week, the former FATA, and because of the spike in the attacks in former tribal areas. The fourth characteristic is the concession of army to India, Pakistani army to India. And we saw the ceasefire on the line of control. And immediately after the ceasefire, General Bajwa then visited the former tribal areas. Number 5 is there is normally a trigger event. But even that is also true when there's a cycle of autocratic rule. So what happened, for example, in 1990, after the Kargil War, the army created a perception that it was the weakness of Nawaz Sharif that resulted in the defeat of the Pakistani army in the Kargil War. Or in 2005, when there was an earthquake and Musharraf government failed to deliver on the relief promises they had made, then we saw that as a trigger event for the weakening of his government. Are we seeing the Afghan peace process as a key characteristic here that will result in this kind of changeover to the democratic cycle? I'm not sure. Are there other events? For example, the killing of a major political leader in Pakistan, Pakistan-India war, a nuclear attack or conspiracy of some sort, that needs to be seen. But a trigger event is an important characteristic of moving to the next cycle. So my analysis is we are seeing some glimpses of maybe a democratic cycle, but we are not there yet. Why is it important? We have to look at the history and to see how the future will look like. If you look at the history, you have the Zia era from 1978 to 88, and then you had a very brief democratic cycle of Benazir era from 98 to 90. And then in the 1990s was basically a military rule, but you had these very weak governments of Nawaz and Benazir. And the moment Nawaz tried to become a little independent, he was removed from power in 1999 by Musharraf. And then you had a very strong showing of Musharraf for the army up until 2005. And then from 2005 onwards, there was a downfall. So you saw this the Musharraf government becoming extremely weak, and finally it fell to Zardari. Nawaz Zardari is the husband of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. So he had a new government in place. Then we had a very long period of so-called democratic cycle. It was 10 years. Before that, we had very short periods of democratic cycles, and we had very long periods of autocratic cycles. In 2018, finally, the army managed to install their own preferred candidate, Imran Khan, in power. But there are already numerous challenges to Imran Khan government. Imran Khan himself is also, he's susceptible to a lot of gaffes. So he's made a mess out of the rule himself too. How does this manifest in Afghanistan? If you look at the era from 79 to 96, you had the jihad and the civil war. So you see when there is predominantly autocratic cycle in Pakistan, you have heightened insecurity in Afghanistan and extremism in Afghanistan. And obviously from 94 and up to 2001, I'm calling this partial rule by Taliban, because initially they ruled maybe one district, but then one or two provinces. Finally, they ruled 90% of the country, and then so it was a partial rule. But during that time, particularly during the Musharraf's era, Taliban enjoyed their probably strongest showing. And then from 2006 up to now, you see the insurgency, but you don't see an extremist violent force supported by Pakistan as the dominant political military force in the country. This also is important to see in the light of engagement of the international community, particularly the Western world, and how their engagement is there. Are they, like in the 80s, supporting an insurgency, particularly a violent insurgency, or are they fighting one? So that factor is also important here. What I'm trying to get out of this is that I think we'll see heightened violence in the coming couple of years. But if the international community, if they even would withdraw their soldiers, but they continue supporting our state financially, I don't think we'll see a violent enterprise such as the Taliban be the dominant military political force in the country. Thank you so much. That's all from me.